Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. We are diving into The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand. We have 5 panelists. We have Robert Tracinski, Sherri Tracinski, Joia, Maritza, and Rupali. 5 panelists. And so we're going to have 5 different presentations between 5 minutes to 15 minutes each to start this meetup off. After which we've got a large audience, some of whom are really familiar with the book, some of whom are not. They are going to pose all their questions. We're going to organize all the questions and everybody is going to answer them. So this is a great way of diving into this book. If you're watching this on YouTube and have not read the book, go ahead and read the book with us. We're going to go chapter by chapter. Today we are covering chapter 1 through 5. All right, with that, I'm going to hand it over first. So today the order is Rob, Joia, Maritza, Rupali, and Sherri. Rob, take it away.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to be dealing with the philosophical aspects of this. And Shrikant said that this is going to be a chance to really go deeply into a book. I feel like we're just flying through it because there's so much. And if you look at philosophical content, this is very much a philosophical novel. So I feel like, okay, I could just hit the highlights for the first 5 chapters or so. There's so much more that we could go deeply into it. So let me just try to do this fairly quickly. First of all, since we're talking about this being a philosophical novel and I'm taking the philosophical aspect, I started with this is the 25th anniversary introduction that she wrote. So this is 1968. She wrote an introduction 25 years after its publication, going in, giving a little overview of the history of it and making some comments on it from that perspective. And here's where she mentions a philosopher whose work that she wanted to compare it to. And she talks about how she initially had the idea of having in sort of the frontispiece as an introduction to this to the whole book, a quote from Friedrich Nietzsche. And she removed it because of her disagreements with his philosophy. But she says here, after talking about what she disagrees with, she says, but as a poet, he projects at times, not consistently, a magnificent feeling for man's greatness, expressed in emotional, not intellectual terms. And then about a sentence later, she says, but if one takes it as a poetic projection of an emotional experience, and if intellectually one substitutes the concept of an acquired basic premise for the concept of an innate fundamental certainty, then that quotation communicates the inner state of an exalted self-esteem and sums up the emotional consequences for which the Fountainhead provides the rational philosophical base. So here's the thing, that whenever you see somebody comment on Ayn Rand, the sort of standard thing is they'll say, oh, she's a version of Nietzschean. There was just there was an article in Quillette in mid-December. Fortunately, I get something published in Quillette just about a week and a half ago, sort of in response, not exactly a direct response to that, but sort of giving a better presentation. But that one in December had the same thing. Ayn Rand was a Nietzschean. And the thing is here, right here, she's telling you, here's the relationship between my philosophy and Friedrich Nietzsche's. And what she's telling you is what she took from Nietzsche is the sort of poetic sense of life level expression of the idea of the greatness of man and self-esteem and a view of man as an end in himself. And this idea of, what's the phrase she uses here? A feeling for man's greatness expressed in emotional, not intellectual terms. And then what she did is she provided as she puts it, the rational philosophical base, substituting her own concepts, her own philosophical concepts for Nietzsche's. So that's really sort of provides the philosophically what's going on. That provides in that introduction, she provides the real overview you need for the book. And she's telling you, this is what The Fountainhead is really all about. It's about taking this sense of the greatness of man and the idea of human self-esteem that's projected by Nietzsche in this irrational form, and then substituting a rational philosophical basis for it. That's the philosophical goal of this philosophical novel. Now, the other part about this, though, is she also points out just a little before that in this introduction, she points out that that philosophical goal is secondary. And she says, what's the purpose of this novel? Well, the purpose, she said, I had to develop these philosophical ideas in order to fully explain and understand, in order to understand the character of Howard Roark and the heroes. In order to understand it for her own purposes, she had to, define the philosophical terms, and also in order to help explain it to the reader and help the reader better understand it. But the purpose of The Fountainhead is not to convey those ideas. She says that, hold on, I think I may be too far forward here. Yeah, she says, I read and write for the sake of the story. My basic test for any story is would I want to meet these characters and observe these events in real life. She says, a little later on, she says, neither politics nor ethics nor philosophy is an end in itself, neither in life nor in literature. Only man is an end in itself. So that's the goal here, is the portrayal of Howard Roark, the portrayal of her hero, her ideal man. That's the goal, and the philosophy is secondary to it. And I think that interesting, this thing of man is an end in himself, and what she sets out to do in The Fountainhead is to portray the kind of man who is an end in himself, someone who is self-sufficient and someone who has the sort of the greatness in his soul that makes him sort of valuable in and of himself. And I found that to be reflected just in the very first scene where we meet Howard Roark. This is the Howard Roark laughed is the first line. And it's this portrayal of Howard Roark is where the novel begins. By the way, something actually came up, and they for a long time, there's been a Fountainhead essay contest for high school kids. And one of the ones I thought made a really insightful point is somebody pointed out that, the novel begins with Howard Roark on a high, standing alone by himself on a high point. And where does it end? It ends with Howard Roark standing alone by himself on a high point, right? So it's this idea. The novel begins and ends with simply this image of Howard Roark. And I'm sure, and that's totally intentional on her part. I'm absolutely certain, because that's what she's saying. The portrayal, the contemplation, this vision of this ideal man is the whole goal of the novel. So that's what she begins with, and that's what she ends with. And one of the things that I thought was interesting here is the way he's portrayed here. He's on this up in the mountain. He's about to dive into a lake. And he says, let's see, the first description, yes. The lake below was only a thin steel ring that cut the rocks in half. The rocks went on into the depth unchanged. They began and ended in the sky, so that the world seemed suspended in space, an island floating on nothing, anchored to the feet of the man on the cliff. Now, literally, this is this great analogy for what she's trying to portray, a man who has an end in himself. So the idea is that he's like, off by himself up in this mountain. He is in this world of his own, which is all anchored to and centered around him, right? So in a way, out in nature, Roark is the self-sufficient man, the man who is an end in himself. And that's how she's portraying him just from that first description. Now, by the way, that's another connection to Nietzsche. I just wanted to mention that, if you know that she's basically saying, she likes the poetry and the imagery of Nietzsche, but she wants to translate it into rational terms. So one of the things that's always reminded me of is the beginning of, hold on, I'm just going to find it out. The beginning of Also sprach Zarathustra, Thus Spake Zarathustra, which is one of Friedrich Nietzsche's especially one of his more poetic and sort of literary works. I mean, Nietzsche's kind of marginal as a philosopher. That he tends not to have if you're looking for a philosopher at these systematically reasoned out arguments, you're not going to find that Nietzsche. You're usually going to find, here's a collection of 40 aphorisms, and Nietzsche was a perfect philosopher for Twitter, because he'd talk in these little snippets, and they would really sound deep and not necessarily make any sense. Like, when you look into the abyss looks also into you, and it's like, wow, that sounds really profound, but what the hell does it mean? And Also sprach Zarathustra is also very poetic, but it starts with his hero, Zarathustra. sort of a fictionalized version of of the prophet that's the basis of the Zoroastrian religion. And it says, when Zarathustra was 30 years old, he left his home and the lake of his home and went into the mountains. There he enjoyed his spirit and solitude, and for 10 years did not weary of it. But at last his heart changed, and rising one morning with the rosy dawn, he went before the sun and spake thus unto it. Anyway, you go on with this. But this idea, this imagery of the self-sufficient man enjoying his, what's the phrase? Enjoying his spirit and solitude up in the mountain, right? I don't think it's a coincidence that the Fountainhead starts with this. That's the poetic part of Nietzsche that she liked, and so she's providing her own version of it. Here's Howard Roark up in the mountains, enjoying his spirit and his solitude, self-sufficient unto himself. And so again, the whole point here is then to take that sort of poetic imagery from Nietzsche, to be inspired by that, to create her own similar poetic imagery, but then also to bring that within the context of her ideas of a more rational version of this defense of human greatness. And let's see. Then I also really like the fact that when Roark leaves and goes down to the next page, the contrast here, the township of Stanton began with a dump. A gray mound of refuse rose in the grass. It smoked faintly. Tin cans glittered in the sun. And this is her introduction to, he comes from the solitude up in the mountains, the man, self-sufficient man all by himself. And as he enters into society, what is there to greet him to represent society?
A steaming dump.
A dump, a steaming dump with tin cans glittering in the sun. So she's clearly setting up this idea of the individual versus society, the individual versus the collective, and the individualist versus the opposite of the individualist. And of course, he comes back to Stanton and he goes to the boarding house of Mrs. Keating, and you have this whole contrast of him to Peter Keating. And Peter Keating is the man who is not self-sufficient. He's the one who's totally oriented towards the outside world and to what other people are. I love the section in this first, so we get Roark has just been expelled. And meanwhile, Keating is getting this glorious reception as the top student, the star student graduating from the Stanton Institute. And this whole obsession he has with Schlenker. Schlenker is his rival at school, and he wears glasses, and physical imperfections in other people loom very large in Keating's mind. You'll see that later on. But he's this sort of rival who Keating defines himself against and has had to beat. And the idea that his rival could have, he defines himself entirely in terms of how do I rate compared to this other person. So we see later there's this discussion about should he accept the job with Franken or go off to the École des Beaux-Arts, and his mom says, well, I guess they'll give the job to Schlenker then. He's like, no, not Schlenker. So he is so oriented towards other people and how other people are looking at him, how they feel about him, how he rates relative to them. And that's the real contrast you're creating here, which is the self-sufficient man enjoying his spirit and solitude in the mountains versus going into the dump of society and having a man who's totally oriented around what do other people think? What are their views? How do I rate relative to them? And her literary method, by the way, she really lets you clues you in to the whole literary method of this early part. She clues you into it later. Now, this is going beyond the section we're discussing today, but it really shows you what she's very deliberately doing as a writer in this first few chapters. And this is a later scene, 268, page 268, page 268 in my version. And Ellsworth Toohey is talking to Dominique Franken. He says, one can make one's point best by contrast, by comparison, as you did in your political article today. To appreciate Peter as he should be appreciated, let's follow up a comparison. Let's take two parallel lines. I'm inclined to agree with Euclid. I don't think these two parallels will ever meet. Well, they both went to Stanton. Peter's mother ran a sort of boarding house, and Roark lived with them for 3 years. This doesn't really matter, except that it makes the contrast more eloquent and, well, more personal later on. Peter graduated with high honors, the highest of his class. Roark was expelled. Don't look like that. I don't have to explain why he was expelled. We understand, you and I. Peter went to work for your father, and he's a partner now. Roark worked for your father and got kicked out. Yes, he did. Isn't that funny, by the way? He did, without any help from you at all, that time. Peter has the Cosmos Slotnick building to his credit, and Roark has a hot dog stand in Connecticut. Peter signs autographs, and Roark is not known even to all the bathroom fixtures manufacturers. Now Roark's got an apartment house to do, and it's precious to him like an only son, while Peter wouldn't even have noticed it had he got the Enright house. He gets them every day. Now, I don't think that Roark thinks very much of Peter's work. He never has, and he never will, no matter what happens. Follow this a step further. No man likes to be beaten, but to be beaten by the man who has always stood as a particular example of mediocrity in his eyes, to start by the side of this mediocrity, and to watch it shoot up while he struggles and gets nothing but a boot in his face, to see the mediocrity snatch from him one after another, the chances he'd give his life for, to see the mediocrity worshipped, to miss the place he wants, and to see the mediocrity enshrined upon it, to lose, to be sacrificed, to be ignored, to be beaten, 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 not by a greater genius, not by a god, but by a Peter Keating. Well, my little amateur, do you think the Spanish Inquisition ever thought of a torture to equal this? So that is Tui's plan for what he's going to try to do to Roark. And we'll see as we read the novel, we'll see how that works out for Ellsworth Tui. But because he has a couple of false premises in there, Tui does, about how this is,
no spoilers.
No spoilers. He has a couple of false ideas in there about how this is going to affect Roark. But what Ayn Rand's telling us in this little section, in the voice of Ellsworth Tui, she's telling us also her own literary method in creating these parallel lines of Tui and Roark. And that's really what we're seeing, especially in the first 5 chapters. We see the rise of Peter Keating, and we see the struggle of Howard Roark. And so, Keating goes off and from star student to the rising star draftsman at Franken and higher. And Roark goes off to work for Cameron, and Cameron's on the way down. And I won't get into that because we've already gone too long. But what I think is interesting, though, is what we really get from this section is we get to see Peter Keating's method. So if you have these parallel lives of Roark versus Keating, we get to see the method of Keating's rise. And the steps are Davis and Stengel. So Davis is one of the top draftsmen in the office whom Keating befriends and then befriends him in order to, while patting him on the back and being his best pal, basically stealing all his work from him and getting him fired. And then boasting afterwards, he finds a new job for Davis and boasts, oh, I got him a current job. I'm a friend, I'm a benefactor, while he's of course been stabbing him in the back this whole time. And then he goes on, Stengel, I think, is the other guy, the chief draftsman for Franken and Higher, the chief designer for Franken and Higher, the guy who actually does all the design work. And he finds out, what Stengel needs and finds a way to get Stengel out of his position so that he can manipulate himself into that position. No, that's within the search.
Okay.
That happens in chapter 5. So I looked it up, so I'm not spoiling anything. So, by chapter 5, by the end of the section we're talking about here, it says, I think on page 71, thus Keating became the chief designer for the firm of Franken and Higher. And he basically does it by stabbing other people in back, by being a manipulator, not by being brilliant at his work, but by being really good at manipulating other people and figuring out what they want and manipulating their perceptions of things. That's the contrast that we're getting to Roark in these parallel lives. So that's, I think, so to wrap up what I'm saying is she has this philosophical theme of man, wanting to portray the man who has an end in himself and define what that means. And then she does it by means of these parallel lives of Keating and Roark. And in this first section, she's establishing that parallel and showing Keating as the man who is entirely focused around other people, what other people think, manipulating other people to promote himself or to promote his status within among other people. And that's really what's being established sort of literarily and philosophically in this first section.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you. So folks, what I would recommend is I'm going to remove the no spoilers limit because all of us are very familiar with, most of the audience is very familiar with. For those who are not, I recommend that you read fast. And so it's impossible to produce spoilers, because I want this to be of lasting value to everybody and being able to connect. There are so many rich connections between parts. So when we're talking about some part, it's a good idea to make all those connections. So don't worry about spoilers. Assume that everybody in the audience, everybody who is watching the YouTube videos knows this book. And you're just focusing on this part in order to say, what does this mean in the whole context of the whole book? So next up is Joia, followed by Maritza, Rupali, and Sherri. Joia.
Thank you. I love how we never plan what we're going to say, but everything that Rob said just absolutely sets up everything that I wanted to talk about. So Shrikant expressed that I love to come from this book from the viewpoint of literature. And the aspect about this book that really fascinates me, the question that I've been asking is, even how did Ayn Rand write this book? Like, what was her process that enabled her to create this book? So this obviously is not my first time reading it. I read it for the first time in 1993 after I had read Atlas Shrugged. But I remember that at the time, just my first experience of reading both those books, and I read them one right after the other, was to recognize that this was an incredible achievement. And of course, in the books, she presents all of these heroes, both in Atlas Shrugged and obviously Howard Roark here in The Fountainhead. And clearly these characters are fictional, but Ayn Rand was real. And she actually achieved this accomplishment that were these novels. And so I've just been obsessed with trying to figure out what was her process and how did she go about doing that. And so what I even am hoping to share in some of these presentations are things that I've learned about her method and her process and how she went about creating this magnificent work that is The Fountainhead. So starting right from the very beginning, and Rob took us even into the introduction, and I wanted to share a little bit from that actually came from a talk that then became an article that we actually all read together when we were going through the Romantic Manifesto, where she talked about the goal of her writing. And then she reflects it here again. But I think that just really sets us up for figuring out how she saw her end and her aim. What was her goal in this book? And as she says here in this talk that she said, that she gave the goal of my writing, an address I gave at Lewis and Clark College on October 1st, 1963. This is the motive and purpose of my writing, the projection of an ideal man, the portrayal of a moral ideal as my ultimate literary goal, as an end in itself, to which any didactic, intellectual, or philosophical values contained in a novel are only the means. And I see this is even how Rob and I are really going to, I think, start to cross paths. Unlike Roark and Keating, Rob and I are definitely going to cross paths, because I think when you're talking about Ayn Rand's novel, you can't talk about her literary achievement and what she's doing in creating the character of Howard Roark without also thinking about what she was doing philosophically, as Rob was already pointing out. And it struck me even this time as I was reading through this book again, and after coming off of the great exploration we did in the Romantic Manifesto, just how unique a project that is literarily. This project of the projection of an ideal man. And I was even thinking to contrast it, for example, with Victor Hugo. And we had talked a lot about Victor Hugo's work when we were going through those essays. And we talked about how Hugo has this view of the grandeur of man. And we talked about how, for example, even his villains like Javert have a certain kind of stature to them. But how that's already something very different from this project of projecting the ideal man, and how what Ayn Rand is attempting to do in her novel is a philosophical project of trying to answer in abstract philosophical terms what is an ideal, which is something that, for example, Hugo, or really none of the other romantics, as we were examining them, while they may have had certain underlying premises and certain views about the stature of humanity, it's very different from what she's trying to do here with this project of projecting the ideal man. So as I was reading it, just even to the question that I was asking myself was even just to for us to think about even what we think about that as a project, and then maybe see about how she goes about answering that. So, what we even think about the project of trying to project the ideal man, and then her specific answer, as we're going to see it in Howard Roark. So then as we go through the book, and Rob started outlining the pattern that we're already seeing here at the beginning. If you look at the very beginning and you hadn't read the book, you would have noticed that the book is divided up into these 4 parts, and each of the 4 parts is the name of a man. And so even if you hadn't read the book, you would see, and I think already start to understand, that we're going to see Howard Roark, and we're going to contrast him with these other men. And certainly what we've seen in the first 5 chapters is this contrast between Howard Roark and Peter Keating. And this to me is very interesting, because one of the things that I learned about how Ayn Rand even started this novel, one of her first inspirations, was she was inspired by someone that she met back in when she was working on her first novel, We the Living. She was, to make the ends meet, she was working in Hollywood, and she met this woman, Marcella, who inspired the character of Peter Keating. And you can even see, just even got the specific details of this story started for her. Like, so she already had this goal, I think even from when she had come over from Russia, that she knew she wanted to be a fictional writer. She knew she wanted to write about heroes. She knew she wanted to project, her philosophy and the moral ideal. But, she didn't really have a story or characters. But one of the first things that kind of got her thinking about this was this encounter she had with Marcella. So I wanted to share from you, this was from a series of interviews that Ayn Rand gave in the early 60s, where she talks about how she was inspired by this encounter with Marcella. And this is what Ayn Rand says about Marcella. She seemed to be enormously ambitious. She was definitely a Hollywood climber. She was a secretary who was taking a hand in production, and she got to be an executive assistant long before she got the title. And I knew I liked that particular quality, that she took her career very seriously. At the same time, I also knew that I disliked everything about her and about her outlook on her career as against mine. And the questions that interested me, taking her as an example, was, what's the difference? Can I define specifically the difference in my attitude and hers? I knew that there was a profound difference, and I couldn't immediately identify the real principle. So while I was considering the question, just in general terms, I decided one day to ask her. I just asked this girl, openly telling her that I know she's ambitious. Can she tell me what is her goal in life? What does she want to achieve? And it was no more profound a question than that. In other words, I didn't have to elaborate, yet she understood me perfectly. And here's the answer she gave me. She said, here's what I want out of life. If nobody had an automobile, I would not want one. If automobiles exist and some people don't have them, I want an automobile. If some people have 2 automobiles, I want 2 automobiles. And this was all that she answered. And I wrote The Fountainhead to this. Observe that I asked her a very wide philosophical question, but almost in a conversational manner. She didn't have to give me that kind of answer. She could have very well said, well, she wants to produce movies or whichever. But it was very strange to me that not only did she understand the real import, but she answered it in a way which was a complete revelation to me. It was literally like one of those light bulbs going off in my mind, like a dramatic revelation. Because A, it integrated an awful lot of things about that type, which I had observed and could not identify the root of. I had so often asked myself, how can they, or what makes them tick? I knew this was an explanation much wider than this girl's, because so many things fell into my place. Because so many things fell into place in my mind. It explained so much. That's A. B, I don't think that without that statement of hers, I could have arrived at this explanation. Because I felt an incredulous, contemptuous horror, not only because I knew that this is true and that many people are motivated by it, but that it's on a conscious level, that someone can know this about her own motive and not be disgusted by it. That is as open as this, because, this is as contemptible a statement, a total lack of integrity or anything firsthand. I mean, it's so secondhanded a statement that I couldn't have given it a better formulation in fiction. And when she said it, it didn't take me very long. It's almost lightning-like that everything fell into place. And what the result of it was that I immediately saw the principle of difference between me and this girl. And that was Roark and Keating. So to me, it was just even illuminating to hear that from Ayn Rand and to hear about her process. And we already are going to see that that's what she's going to be dramatizing. And we get the glimpse of how she put that into the character of Howard Roark at the end of this first chapter, when he's starting to recognize that there's something about, in this example, it's the dean that he doesn't understand. And similarly, that he's going to see that the dean is like other people, and there's something that makes them tick. And what is it? And there's some principle behind the dean that he's going to go after and discover. But we already see, from Ayn Rand, having already figured it out, how she grasped this principle from this answer that she got from Marcella. And then we're going to see how she starts to dramatize it through these characters. So then in the book, I wanted to just take us to the very beginning and that iconic first line, Howard Roark laughed. And I do think it's important to just stop and reflect on that opening, precisely because what we know about her project to project the ideal man. And this is how we're seeing him. And Rob already, I guess, gave the spoiler for the end to tell you that the book is going to end how it begins with Howard Roark, kind of alone and at the height of thinking about his work and kind of in the place of this height, and with this just joyous experience of life and the Howard Roark laughter. And from here, I even wanted to share something that is in the journals of Ayn Rand, where she's talking about how she even thought about what this laughter was about. And so this was in the journals, and she's talking about the introduction here. And she says, his laughter as the meaning of the earth around him, as its song, as the release of its tension, triumphant and complete ecstasy. See Nietzsche about laughter. And as Rob pointed out, Rand was not a fan of Nietzsche's philosophy, but she definitely got a lot from his poetry. And in her journals, she even wrote out some lines from Thus Spoke Zarathustra that are the poetry that really inspired her. And you guys know I love the poetry, so I wanted to share even what she got from the poetry of Nietzsche that was also in her journals here. So she copied out these lines from Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Oh, my brethren, I heard a laughter which was no human laughter, and now gnaweth a thirst at me, a longing that is never allayed. My longing for that laughter gnaweth at me. Oh, how can I still endure to live, and how could I endure to die at present? So I think from the poetry there, we see this emotion of ecstasy that she wants to capture. But as Rob was pointing out, Ayn Rand versus Nietzsche, that Ayn Rand is going to think even more about what are the philosophical premises that allow a person to reach this state. And it's part of, I think, what we're going to explore throughout this whole book, but we're going to see that there is that crucial connection between his approach to his work and what his work means to him, that it's precisely in what he's doing with his mind, his first-handed approach to nature, to problem solving, to taking that first-handed approach to thinking and then expressing it in his work and being first-handed in both his thinking and his work. That those are, we're going to see here, the philosophical premises that are going to make possible this emotion that she can grasp from Nietzsche. And then I only talked about the first sentence, but I'm going to leave it here with just one more thing that I wanted to share, which came out of another essay that she had written later after she had finished the book, just kind of describing what the book was all about. And this was a description of the end, but as Rob was already pointing out, that the end just takes us back to the beginning. Oh, and I just totally lost my quote here. Wait, sorry. Give me a second. Sorry. So this was a quote where she's talking about how we leave Howard Roark, but how we leave Howard Roark at the end of the book is how we encounter him at the very beginning and what we learn about him. And what she says is, and in that work, he has found a height of happiness unknown to most men. He has made the world a better place by the fact of making such happiness possible, by the fact of making it exist within his own soul. And the realization of man's capacity for ecstasy is the only reason for this world's existence, or so the author believes. And that is where I will leave you now. And I'll leave everyone else to take you through the rest of the book beyond the first sentence.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. I will continue with the spoilers to talk about the beginning and the end. Yes, beginning and the end is the same, but there is a big difference. In the beginning, he's alone. He has not interacted with anybody at a cultural level. He's in a state of nature, and he has come up, and he has the core of what is needed to transform that nature. At the end, he's standing on the top of the tallest skyscraper in the world that he has built. So it is him in nature that is with something in him that carries him to the end, where he's at the top of the world by building something in the world, in New York City, with other people, with somebody coming up to meet him. So it is, yes, go ahead. Joia, you had something?
I just had one more thing. That when you said that, you just reminded me of one of my favorite lines from the introduction of this book, where people ask her, all these years after she had written The Fountainhead, how had she changed? And she had this famous answer where she said, "I am the same, only more so." And I think that's exactly what you are describing here. The way that Howard Roark was the same, but by precisely going through this process, only more so.
Thank you, Joia. Next up is Maritza, Rupali, and Sherri. Maritza.
Wow. So this book and I have walked together for decades. I'm rereading this book with you guys here. And I am reading this for the first time since I got introduced to Louis Sullivan and read a few of his works. So I'm finding it's almost like a new read for me, which is kind of fascinating and unexpected. A little bit, I think I'm going to find, I'm a little shocked to find there's a little more dissonance than there has been in the past for me here with Ayn Rand. But what stood out for me in these first couple chapters is this strength that we see within Howard Roark and the contrast of everyone with whom he interacts. That's my front door. Okay, sorry. Apologies. So there's this juxtaposition of the steadfastness, the quiet, the calm that we see in Roark as compared to his interactions with so many people. And you see that from the very, very beginning. I mean, we are in chapter 1 still, when we come across one of the very first lines, like when, I was still a teenager, maybe 15, perhaps even a little younger, was the first time I read this book. And I was hooked by page 23. The reason I know I was hooked by page 23, because Roark is sitting with the dean and he's being expelled, right? 3 years in college. The dean is like, it was a tough decision because some of the professors loved him, some of them hated him. And Roark seems to be this kind of person. He's divisive. And so the dean's trying to throw him a bone, I guess, and trying to see what his options are. And Roark's like, I'm going to be an architect. Remember, this is a student who's sitting in an architect school, just expelled. He's not going to get his degree in architecture, but he's like, I want to be an architect. And so he says it matter-of-factly, politely. And the dean is like, yeah, I don't think that's going to happen. Or they're talking and the dean's like, but you're surely not going to be able to do these things, your drawings. That's not going to work. And calmly, Roark is like, sure I am. And he's like, you mean to tell me you're thinking seriously of building that way when and if you're an architect? Because, in the dean's mind, he's like, this kid is bonkers. And Howard Roark responds, one word, yes. And the dean says, my dear fellow, who will let you? And Roark's response is why I can read this book 1,000 times and not tire of it. He said, that's not the point. The point is, who will stop me? And that's Howard Roark throughout the entirety of the book. That is the ideal to which I have been trying to align my life. And maybe not reaching, but that's the decades. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to be someone who can sit in front of someone who thinks I'm inferior and calmly tell them who's going to stop me. That's impactful to me. And you see that in these 5 chapters, you see it over and over again. Now, he's not putting on airs, but he's off-putting to others, because what we're being shown here, and this, I think it's phenomenal writing. I think the author does an amazing job of painting this picture of how disliked Howard Roark is by people who consider them to be his friends or his peers, or even people in the periphery, you know, the woman with whom he's boarding, the dean, the professors, co-workers. It's not because he himself is really insufferable, but it's because the picture being painted is that we live in a world and a society where so few people are true to themselves that it's very off-putting to the outside world. And but the funny thing is that it's not a struggle for Roark. And to me, that's the part that's really, really interesting, is that many of us who want to be true to ourselves, sometimes the struggle, right? We're always trying to be a better version of ourselves, you know, walking that meaningful path. But this ideal, it doesn't even occur to him. Like, it's in the same chapter, still the same conversation with the dean. The dean's like, you don't care what others think, which might be understandable, but you don't care even to make them think as you do. Like, it doesn't compute to the dean that here sits a 22-year-old unconcerned about how he's viewed by others, or about changing the mind of others to his perspective. And again, Roark is just one word answer: no. The dean's response is to tell him that opinion is monstrous. And Roark agrees. He says, is it? Maybe. I couldn't say. To me, this is like, again, it's so profound because it points out some, maybe inadequacy is too deep a word, but it points out where there's room for improvement in all of us, as it were. Whereas the idea of being so sure of something that no other opinion would even occur to you to wonder about, I think that's enticing. In similar vein, though, I see here a caution on wondering whether or not, how much individualism is too much. And that's a question I've struggled with a lot. You know, I come from a culture that, you know, individuality is not held up on a pedestal at all. We are, you know, chaperone-centric, community-centric, definitely. And so, you know, when I was reading this, I almost felt a guilty pleasure in rooting for this, you know, severe individual. And like, I see myself, I see pieces of myself in this person. I'm not as good as Roark, but I see pieces of me, and that's a good thing, right? And looking at this here, I think this book gives permission to the reader to see pieces of themselves in these characters. The manner in which they're presented is literally beautifully done. Even Keating, we grow to see what a snake Keating is in private, and what a charming individual he is in public. And if we're really honest with ourselves, we actually see a little bit of ourselves, not only in Roark, but also in Keating, also in his mother, a little bit maybe in this dean, and in Francone. So that's, to me, that's beautifully done character development. She makes us see that a little bit of us resides in all of these characters. And I don't personally think her goal was that, but she's a really good author, and so that can be seen. The in chapter 2, Keating and Roark are sitting, because Keating, he's sure of nothing. He's sure of nothing. So there's a scene in chapter 2, and then one again in chapter, is it chapter 5? I think either chapter 4 or 5, where Keating is seeking advice from Roark. And the funny thing is, he's seeking advice from this person whom he secretly despises. And he doesn't despise them because he doesn't like them, because he also secretly likes him. But he views in this person something that shines a spotlight on where he's failing, and he doesn't want to see that. And yet, that same thing that he sees where he's failing is why he gravitates towards this person to seek that advice, because that advice makes more import to him than all of the superficial ones he's surrounded by. So when he's trying to determine if he's going to go straight to work with Francon or to the school, right? They're called the Bonnard, I think it is. And so he's asking Peter, he's asking Howard Roark about advice, and Roark says to him, if you want my advice, Peter, you've already made a mistake by asking me, by asking anyone. Never ask people, not about your work. Don't you know what you want? How can you stand it not to know? And, Peter tells him he's not sure in this. And then, he says, I really mean it. You always know, how do you decide always? And Roark's response is, how can you let others decide for you? And to me, that has the same impact of, that's not the point. The point is, who will stop me? And that's super, super enticing and ideal to try to live up to. That's what I see there. And he does it again when when Keating finally does all of his, offhanded behavior, and he lands at the desk of the draftsman. But now he has to sit and he actually has to create something before everything was done for him. He doesn't know what he's doing. He takes a whole bunch of days and he's drawing. And then he says, were he to be told this was the best or the ugliest house in the world, he would agree with either. He was not sure. And those are two sides of one coin. We're shown here, this resides in all of us. It's a matter of which choice you make. Do you allow all of your decisions to be made for you? Do you make those decisions yourself? Because here, this is where it comes down to. You run the risk of never being sure if you don't ever make your own decisions. And then something like the success where you're the person in charge, you don't even know if you can enjoy it, because you'll never know where you stand there. And this is gonna unfold more, and we're gonna see this developing theme throughout the book. And for me, I suspect I'm gonna struggle a little bit with, is there too much individuality here? I'm hoping the answer is gonna be no, because this has been my favorite book for a very long time. But I just want to share with you guys that's what I'm seeing here develop. We have this strength that we see in Roark that is lacking in Keating. But I think it would be dangerous for us to say that one is, this is definitely the preferred method, because again, life is not an either or kind of statement. Somehow we have to find a way to live with both, because I really don't think there exists a Roark or just a Keating. In actuality, most of us are a little bit of both. So how do we find a way to get that good percentage? And maybe walking through this story, we'll get some more pointers. Thanks, guys.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Maritza. Next up, folks. So as soon as Rupali and Sherri are done, we're going to open it up for everybody else. You can ask questions. If you have read the entire Fountainhead, you can go ahead and give like a 2-minute piece on what you think about this section. Otherwise, and then in addition to that, we'll do questions. All right. So next up is Rupali. Rupali, go ahead.
Well, it's great to be back with everybody again. So hello, everyone. And I will say that, it's great to come back to this book. I came across Fountainhead about 33 years ago. I cannot believe it was that long time ago, because it feels like yesterday. I feel like I just saw this yesterday. And I came across Fountainhead through a Pakistani TV serial. So that was very unusual. So in Pakistan in 1980s, they had adapted The Fountainhead into a TV serial of 13 episodes called Tisra Kinara, The Third Shore. And my mom and I used to watch this TV serial in India. And every time they would do the credits, it would say The Fountainhead adapted from a story by Ayn Rand. And I'd never heard of Ayn Rand. And so I went to a local library down the road and I picked up The Fountainhead over there and started reading. But why did I like this Pakistani TV serial? Because it was nothing like what was shown on Indian TV, right? The role of a woman in India did not match the lead character, the Dominic's equivalent in the serial, because this was a woman who was independent. She did not need anyone to tell her what was right or wrong. She didn't depend on anybody. She thought for herself. She was passionate. She made no excuses for her behavior or didn't require permission from anybody. And it was just refreshing to see that such a human being could be possible. Because traditionally in India, you are, as much as there's democracy and as much as I grew up in a very open-minded family, it wasn't a permissive family for sure, but we had a lot of freedoms growing up. My mom or dad never said that you need to do this or that, but culturally, the environment expected a woman to be a certain way. And I was in probably middle school or high school, and I was thinking about these ideas myself about, what kind of a person do I want to be? And here was an example. And then you have the equivalent of Howard Roark. And you think, this is how a man should be. And I'm just telling you how I felt it at that time as a young girl, that a man can be somebody who can stand up for his values, for what he believes in, and doesn't have to give in to what's acceptable as norm. One of the things that the dean says to Howard Roark, he says, look here, this is serious. I know, don't interrupt me. You've seen a modernistic building or two, and it gave you ideas. But do you realize what a passing fancy that whole so-called modern movement is? You must learn to understand, and it has been proved by authorities that everything beautiful in architecture has already been done. There is a treasure mine in every style of the past. We can only choose from the great masters. Who are we to improve upon them? We can only attempt to respectfully repeat. And this is something I saw in India, especially with the religious background. India is an ancient, it has a big past history, and that continues to be part of the culture. I'm not saying that's wrong, but it is steeped into everything that you do. And to say that, look, you can think for yourself. You don't have to do. There was some first person who came up with an idea about even the past old religions or the old styles. And I want to be that first person to set a new tradition or to do something new. So, so that was very refreshing for me when I saw this Pakistani serial. And then, of course, I went ahead and read the book, and it just resonated with me. And, I have been reading this book every now and then. I go back to it often. But 78 years after its publication, this book is still popular. It's still relevant today. So what makes it so popular, right? And now that I'm a mother and an educator, an individual, an architect, I think of it through all those lenses. And one of the things that I think about is when I look at children in high school or just going into college, just on the brink of adulthood, and they're confused and they come to me for advice or to say, I don't know what I want to do in college, I'm not sure, or they're depressed or anxious. I often wonder why is that? Because youth is supposed to be full of hope and full of life, looking forward to this exciting journey you're going to have in life. And why is that? And you look back and you feel, okay, they were never given the tools to teach them what they could do with their own hands and brains. They're not taught to think for themselves, or they're not taught about the ideals, and not taught about who are these great heroes. Why do we need to read great books? Why do we need to study history? One of the things Ayn Rand talks about in one of her interviews is why she chose not to study literature, but to study history and to understand people who came before us, because that then gives us a place to stand and also for her to develop her characters. And so, when education is lacking these ideals, then what are the kind of children we are bringing into our future? And what kind of future are they going to have if they don't have the skills that they need to succeed? And so I feel 78 years later, this book is still relevant because it shows you what you can be. And like Maritza said, there's a little bit of Howard Roark, there's a little bit of Dominic, there's a little bit of Keating in all of us. One character that I absolutely detested was Tuhi. Ayn Rand has done a fantastic job of creating each character so beautifully. And somebody just recently said to me, the characters are so pure that they're not real, they're not possible. And I thought, well, it's by making them so pure that she can keep them in stark opposition with each other and create the drama that's necessary to bring about the ideas that she is talking about in this book. So if you look at the portrait of the different characters here, so I talked about Dominic and why she appealed to me right away when I saw the TV serial. I would say the same thing with Howard Roark, that he can think for himself. And then she has a contrasting person. I think I joined towards the end of Rob's conversation. So I think Rob was talking about the two comparisons and to show the two extremes, so you can see, what is possible if you apply your will, if you apply a reasoning mind, and you stand for your values, as opposed to trying to appease, trying to do the easy thing. Or you look at Keating's life and how he tries to get his jobs. Now, one thing, after the time that I was reading this book, my father was setting up a factory in India. And there is a lot of bureaucracy, at least back then, there was a lot of bureaucracy in India. And there were these corrupt politicians. And every time I went with my father to get a permit, I would see, oh, this is Tuhi. And you could see the character. And I was like, really, just be squeamish, because I could just strangle that man. But of course, he had all the power. And someone like my father, who had the knowledge, who had the courage, who had the ability. I often would think of my father as Hank Rearden, because I would see him fire up the furnace in the factory and hear the machines going when they would start, the drums would start beating. And then he was beholden to all these politicians who just had the power. They had no vision. They had absolutely no desire to make anything better. They had no desire to do anything wonderful for themselves or people around them. And they would hold these men and women who were creators at their mercy to be able to, just get some money out of them, some bribes. And that was the reality. It still is in many parts of India. And the portrayal that she does of corruption in this book is real. And we need people like Howard Roark. We need people like Dominic. We need, people like Hank Rearden and John Galt to kind of stand up and say, there is another possibility. And one thing that Rohit and I, my husband and I, found over here was when we came to the US, this book is very, very popular in India. I had some friends over today just before this event, and they saw The Fountainhead lying on my kitchen counter, and she said, "Oh, I read this book in college. That's what you do in college. You read Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged." And I said, "So what do you think?" She said, "Oh yeah, it was something we read." And I realized people read it. Some people read it as a story. Some people read it and understand it. And some people have the courage to apply it in their lives. And I found more people in America who have been able to apply it in their lives. And thank goodness for that, because we can make a better world. So I'm really delighted to be a part of this conversation. The other thing that I wanted to highlight was Henry Cameron's character based on Louis Sullivan. And we had just read an autobiography of an idea. We've read The Kindergarten Chats. And when Ayn Rand introduces Henry Cameron, she talks about his buildings. And she says, something was growing in him with each new building, struggling, taking shape, rising dangerously to an explosion. The explosion came with the birth of the skyscraper. When structures began to rise, not in tier on ponderous tier of masonry, but as arrows of steel shooting upwards without weight or limit. Henry Cameron was among the first to understand this new miracle and to give it form. He was among the first and few when he accepted the truth that a tall building must look tall. While architects cursed, wondering how to make a 20-story building look like an old brick mansion, while they used every horizontal device available in order to cheat of its height, shrink it down to tradition, hide the shame of its steel, make it small, safe, and ancient, Henry Cameron designed skyscraper in straight, vertical lines, flaunting their steel and height. While architects drew friezes and pediments, Henry Cameron decided that the skyscraper must not copy the Greeks. Henry Cameron decided that no building must copy any other. And then when Howard Roark is talking to his dean, you see the same conversation in his belief that no building should be like any other. Each individual is unique, and so every building must be unique. So I think that there is so much for us to think about in this book. There's one line that, now that we are doing the Gita and the Bhagavad Gita, the Tao Te Ching and Bible. And of course, all of these ideas have come from human beings. And Ayn Rand says in the introduction, she says, neither politics nor ethics nor philosophy is an end in itself, neither in life nor in literature. Only man is an end in himself. And she starts the book with the quote, whatever their future at the dawn of their lives, men seek a noble vision of man's nature and life's potential. And so what is possible with all of us being able to use our creative instincts, I think is just a huge possibility out there. And the Fountainhead kind of lays that vision out for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rupali. Wonderful. Folks, now it's going to be Sherri, after which we're going to go directly into questions first. So formulate your questions, and then we will go ahead and take all the questions, organize them, and everybody gets to answer all the questions. All right. Sherri, you're the finale.
Okay. So I apologize if you hear a dog barking in the background. There's been a delivery here. And so if you can, hopefully she's calmed down enough that everybody can hear me. This is such a great idea for all of us. We originally agreed to this time period of about 10 weeks or something like that, because it's what we could all fit in our schedules. And as soon as I started reading the first 5 chapters for, I don't know, the 15th, 6th, I don't know how many times I've read it, I realized that it isn't possible for me to, Shrikant told me I had 15 minutes to talk. I said, I don't know how I can fit this in 15 minutes. There's 15 things to talk about just in chapter 1. So Rob has convinced me that I need to take a deeper dive into this. And for those of you that have been in these before, I usually come at these from the background of architecture and architectural history. And this is such a rich book to discuss architectural theory and architectural history that Rob has convinced me to start a Substack newsletter on this. So if you're not getting enough of the art and architectural history, come on over and I'll dive in deeper into a lot of these topics. And Rob's pointing here. Wow. It's at fountainhead.substack.com. It hasn't started yet, but it should be starting shortly.
Yeah, there's no actual content, just an instruction page. Yeah. You can sign up on the free list and be ready when stuff starts to come out. I was tapping on that because, you know, the writer's imperative is you always got to plug your latest projects. So.
Rob, go ahead and put it in the chat whenever you get a chance.
Okay. Okay, and his keyboard functions, so it'll get the right number of letters this time. So, and I love also what Joia was talking about from her section about how there's the fiction and the reality, and talking about the method in which Ayn Rand was using to draw items from the world and bring them clarified and crystallized into her writing. A lot of this we discussed when we were reading the Romantic Manifesto, which people constantly had to remind me wasn't about architecture, about fiction. But anyway, we were doing a lot of that discussion. So I'm going to be kind of coming at it from that perspective and showing, hopefully, the idea that's been out in the world that Howard Roark is plucked straight from Frank Lloyd Wright, and that Cameron is completely plucked from Louis Sullivan, and that everything is just a mirror of their lives. I'm hoping that I can show that this is a much richer soil, that she took pieces from, inspiration here and there, and crystallized them to make the great characters and descriptions of buildings and architectural theory. It isn't from any one person. So to start with here, I'm going to go back to this introduction, this one paragraph.
This is her original introduction. Though.
Yes, her original introduction from 1943, where she says, and I'm only going to read the first paragraph here. It's only 2 paragraphs long, but she writes, I offer my profound gratitude to the great profession of architecture and its heroes who have given us some of the highest expressions of man's genius, yet have remained unknown, undiscovered by the majority of men, and to the architects who gave me their generous assistance in the technical matters of this book. So as I go through, I'm going to show you as many of the little tidbits that I've been able to find that I've known throughout history. When I know that there's a direct link that we know Ayn Rand read this or knew about a specific thing, I'll make sure that you know that. But many, many times it'll just be, this was in the air. This was common around the time. This was in the field of architecture at the time when she was doing her research. So sometimes I'll have an exact positive connection, and sometimes it'll just be what I see as a connection. So the very first thing I want to start with here is this second chapter, or the second paragraph in chapter 1, just after Howard Roark laughs. And this line, I want you to listen to the way she writes about the earth that Howard Roark is standing on. She's writing about it from the way an architect sees materials and the world around them. So here it is. He stood naked at the edge of a cliff. The lake lay far below him. A frozen explosion of granite burst into flight to the sky over motionless water. The water seemed immovable, the stone flowing. The stone had a stillness of one brief moment in battle, when thrust meets thrust, and the currents are held in the pause more dynamic than motion. The stone glowed, wet with sun rays. The lake below was only a thin ring that cut the rocks in half. The rocks went on into the depth unchanged. They began and ended in the sky, so that the world seemed suspended in space, an island floating on nothing, anchored to the feet of the man on the cliff. There are sections later, not only in this chapter or the 5 chapters we were reading, but throughout the entire book, where Howard Roark is talking about a specific material, of how he can use it, what he can do with it, what he sees in it. The beginning here.
Yeah.
And at the bottom of this first page, we get to another section where he says, he was looking at the granite. He did not laugh as his eyes stopped in awareness of the earth around him. His face like a law of nature. One thing could not question, alter, or implore. And then we get into the description.
Yeah, that's what.
And then he looks at the granite, to be cut, he thought, and made into walls. He looked at a tree, to be split and made into rafters. He looked at a streak of rust on the stone and thought of the iron ore under the ground, to be melted and to emerge as a girder against the sky. The rocks, he thought, are here for me, waiting for the drill, the dynamite, and my voice, waiting to be split, ripped, pounded, and reborn, waiting for the shape my hands will give them. So one of the really interesting things that reminds me of is a piece of writing done by Frank Lloyd Wright that we have thanks to Shoshana Milgram Knapp. I don't know if any of you know her. She has made a positive connection that this is an article or a journal that Ayn Rand had in her hands. She actually quotes, Ayn Rand quotes from another section on the same page from this journal in her first letter that she writes to Frank Lloyd Wright. It is the Journal of Taliesin Fellows. This is from the very first episode of, issue. Thank you. The very first issue of the journal. And Frank Lloyd Wright is talking about materials in a very similar way. He writes this: the country between Madison and Janesville, near my home and workshop, Taliesin, is the old bed of an ancient glacier drift. Vast, busy gravel pits abound there, exposing heaps of yellow aggregate once and everywhere else, sleeping beneath the green fields. Great heaps, clean and golden, are always waiting there in the sun. And I never pass on my way to and from Chicago without an emotion, a vision of the long dust-whitened stretches of the cement mills grinding to impalpable fineness, the magic powder that would set it all to some imagined shape. And then I wish both mill and gravel heaps endlessly subject to my will. Nor do I come to a lumber yard with its city-like graduated masses of fresh shingles, boards, and timbers without taking a deep breath of its fragrance, seeing the great living forests laid low in lumber piles by processors that cut and shaped the trees to the architect's scale of feet and inches, coveting it, all to make another forest abstract in the spirit of the original. The rock ledges of a stone quarry are a story and a longing to me. There is a suggestion in the strata and character in the formation. I like to sit and feel the stone as it is there. Often I have a thought, were great monumental buildings ever given to me to build, I would go to the Grand Canyon of Arizona to ponder them. When in early years, I looked south from the massive stone tower in the auditorium building. There's a little Easter egg there for all of our Sullivan fans. A willing pencil in the hand of a master. He's of course talking about Sullivan here. The red glare of the Bessemer steel converters to the south of Chicago would thrill me as the pages of the Arabian Nights used to do, with a sense of terror and romance. And smothered incandescence of the kiln, the fabulous heat baking mineral and chemical treasure on mere clay to issue in all the hues of the rainbow in every shape conceivable by imagination, never to yield to time, subject only to the violence or carelessness of man. These great ovens would cast a spell on me as I listened to the subdued roar within them. The potter's thumb and finger deftly pressed the soft mass whirling on its wheel as it smoothly yields to his touch. The glowing bulbous glass at the end of a slender pipe as the breadth of a glass blower, and his deft turning decides its shape, its fate. These too fascinate me. Something was being born. Colors in paste or crayon or wax pencils, always a thrill. To this day, I love to hold a handful of many colored cylinders living potential upon my palm in the light. Mere accidental colored chalk marks. The sunlit sidewalk perhaps will give me pause, and something in me harks back to something half remembered, deeply felt, and as though an unseen door had opened, the distant music had, for an instant, come trembling to my senses in this native sense of earth. Treasure is in our earth buried deep in the ground with no end. Mineral matter and metal stores, tattered riches folded away in an endless vein of gleaming quartz, gold and silver, lead and copper, tawny iron ore, all lying in drifts to yield themselves up to the roaring furnace, to the flow obedient to the hand of the master mind, all to become pawns to human will in the part human imagination plays in the human game we call civilization. And he goes on here to several other, and this becomes a theme. He talks about different materials in the next couple of issues of the Taliesin journals. But you can see here, having read that, what kind of inspiration, which she is seeing from the world of architecture. This is the reason why she sees this as a great backdrop for her story. But you'll notice also sometimes it's not you'll notice this separation she pulls. She will take a detail and switch it around. For example, back when we were reading about Sullivan's autobiography of an idea before the new year, we had a situation, I think I read it there too, so I'm only going to just briefly discuss it here. But we had, I had mentioned it then, that there is a very similar situation that happens. We have this example on page 47, at least in my edition, of Howard Roark deciding that he is going to work for Cameron. This isn't an option in his mind. It's he, the employee, is going to work for him. And then it's brought up to Cameron. And there's this absolutely fantastic example, this lovely bit of writing where she's writing Cameron's side of this and how he's angry and tries to toss him out. It begins with, "Why, the damn fool, throw him out." And then, "Wait, send him in." And then there's this reaction that happens back and forth. At the very end, he says, "Come to work in," which part are you talking?
I should like to work for you, sir.
Oh, and then Roark comes into the office and says, "I should like to work for you." The tone of his voice says, "I am going to work for you." We have this lovely scene in the end. Howard Roark gets the job, told to show up first thing in the morning. We have a very similar scene that happens between Louis Sullivan when he goes to Boston, discovers a Frank Furnace building in the city. It's the only building that he likes. And then he decides he is going to go work for Frank Furnace. And they have a very similar kind of story of what happens in Sullivan's autobiography about that job experience. And in this particular case, Frank Furnace has a kind of a similar reaction. He first criticizes Roark's education, passes it off as utterly useless. You'll be unable to think. And then through conversation, finally decides, yeah, okay, I'll give you the job. And it starts from Sullivan's view. He says, "All right," said he of the glorious beard, this is Frank Furnace, with something scraggy on his face that might have been a smile, "Come tomorrow morning for a trial, but I prophesy you won't outlast a week." So Louis came, and at the end of that week, Furnace said, "You may stay another week." And at the end of that week, Furnace said, "You may stay as long as you like." So we have a very similar kind of interaction during this job interview. And it's this particular case, I think Ayn Rand was possibly pulling from Sullivan rather than from Frank Lloyd Wright, as most people are assuming. And then there's another really fantastic little nugget that I absolutely can't get past the first chapter without mentioning. And this is when Roark is talking with the dean, and he says, "A building is alive like a man." And for, again, those of us who've read Sullivan, this ties into what Sullivan is talking about in Kindergarten Chats. But let me continue. He says, "Its integrity is to follow its own truth in its single theme and to serve in its own single purpose. A man doesn't borrow pieces of his body. A building doesn't borrow hunks of its soul." And that has always struck me because, one, it's such a beautiful visual experience when you read that, you see that in your mind and you think, oh my God, how bizarre would that be for a building to borrow chunks of another? How that couldn't possibly work. Well, here is a case where it does. Can we share screen, Shrikant?
Go ahead.
Okay. This has actually happened. Rob is trying to get to it.
Safari. There
Allow to zoom.
we go.
Okay, Rob's got a new computer and he's got to allow security.
Okay.
Hang on a second, everybody. So I'll continue while you figure this out. So when Ayn Rand was in Chicago, there is a very famous building competition, the Chicago Tribune Tower competition, which, little spoiler here, was known at the time as the most beautiful building in the world competition. And we know that Ayn Rand was aware of this competition because in her archives, in her notes for researching on the Fountainhead, there is a tracing of one of the buildings that didn't win the first, but there was, there was this journal that came out in 1924 of all of the people who had designed for this competition. And Ayn Rand has a tracing of some of these buildings on thin onion skin paper in her journals. And they are, so this is a direct connection that we know she was very much aware of this competition. Well, the winning example, if we can pull it up.
I'm trying to.
The winning example is the Chicago Tribune Tower.
I can't figure out how to let us,
let's do it next time.
We'll do it next time, but let me tell you, the building has actual chunks of other buildings. They have artifacts pulled out from the Great Pyramids at Giza, from Notre Dame Cathedral, from the Comiskey Stadium in Chicago, buildings from all across the world. Little chunks of these buildings are taken out and they're plugged into the base of the Chicago Tribune Tower. And next to each one of them, there is an engraving that tells you where this part of this building has come from, where this chunk is from. They stand out like little warts on the side of the building. And once I had that image of that building in my head, now I can never read that particular section without thinking, was she thinking of that specific building? She was aware of it. Was she thinking of that specific building?
She lived in Chicago at the time for about a year.
When she wrote that line. So that's another one of the little nuggets that I like to pull out and share of where the many wide variety of inspirations that she may have gotten from the architecture world.
Thank you, Sherri. So I'm going to just make a brief comment. I'm going to take some, poetic liberties here to talk about this. I love the sentence that Sherri read. The water seemed immovable and the stone flowing. This is the heart of the issue. What is the prime mover? And what is it that is moved? What is the function and what is the form? That is the heart of it. This book is called The Fountainhead. It is saying that within us, there is this living fountain, which is the cause of everything. Whatever we see outside, the social structures, the cities that we built, is the result of these fountains in operation within individuals. People, so the stone is flowing, actually. It's like the Grand Canyon. The world is like Grand Canyon. The stone is the flowing thing. The fountain is the thing that is making it flow. People like Peter Keating simply reverse the causality. They take forms as given. And once you do that, it kills the function within them. There is nothing inside them. There is no I. That is what the this book is about. All right, folks, so I'm going to open it up for questions. Go ahead and if you would like to ask a question, go ahead and type an exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom. Try to keep your questions brief. I want to feel free to ask as many questions about anything as you want. And I'll collect all the questions, we'll organize them, and then we will go ahead and all proceed to answer all of them. So it's going to be Houheneka, Rich, and Joe. Houheneka.
My question is through the first 5 chapters about relationships. And in particular, I wanted to know what people thought of the relationship between Keating and Peter, Roark and Peter. And I think we already spoke about Roark and Cameron. So those 2 relationships in particular, because with both of those characters, they see Peter for who he is. Mm-hmm. And he likes them, and yet he gets angry with them. And so just wondering what people thought about that.
Excellent question. Thank you, Houheneka. Next up is going to be Rich, followed by Joe. Rich.
Yes, thanks. Yeah, I read the first 5 chapters. So I guess my first question is, although there's a strong component of art in architecture, there is also a very strong component of functionality, and that buildings are meant to be lived in, passed through, worked in. So the focus exclusively on being true to yourself and doing what you feel is correct. I'm just curious why Rand chose architecture as opposed to, let's say, something that's more pure, like pure art, which does not have these 2 competing things. And in fact, it came up in the discussion with the dean, where the dean makes the point of, architecture is for the client, it's to be used by the client. So it's acknowledged, but it's sort of dismissed. So I'm just curious, obviously there are many people who are very familiar with this, so I'm sure that's an answer.
Excellent question, love the question. Thank you, folks. These are great questions. Keep them coming. And afterwards, after we've answered all the questions, at the end, you will have, if you have read Fountainhead, you will have 2 minutes to talk about what you got from it. Okay, next up is going to be Joe. Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I really liked how everybody talked about the stark opposition of the characters themselves and how they're extremes and how that drives their interaction. One of the things that I was kind of thinking of is just, what is Ayn Rand really saying about schools or education in general? I mean, I think it's a real critique on that, and I would like to hear Rupali's input on that more than,
Okay.
Everybody's input, but
Thank you, Joe. JF has some questions. The question about what are the typical criticisms of Ayn Rand's philosophy, and how are they countered? The typical criticisms. Okay, does anybody want to put any more questions on the table? Folks, if you want, we'll go ahead and start dealing with these questions. If you have questions, any more questions, just put a question mark in the chat, and we'll keep adding questions as we go on. Okay, I'm going to take questions. I'm going to start with I really like Rich's question because it goes to the heart of the theme here. I will pose it as follows. Why do you think Ayn Rand chose architecture as the backdrop for this novel? And how does a person's choosing something that they feel is right and the objective functionalities of, let's say, a site or the problem, how do they interact with one another? Before we go for that, let's see if Jyoti has one more. Jyoti, you have a question, right?
Actually, it is a question that Rupali asked me why is this book so popular?
Very good. Why is this book popular? Very good.
Right.
We'll take that. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. So the question about why architecture and what is the connection between an individual, this one. So go ahead, and if you would like to answer, go ahead and type an exclamation mark. I see Joia's hand, so I will take that as an exclamation mark. That's the low-tech exclamation mark. Go ahead.
Thanks. And I think there's a really even broad answer that I'm sure the other panelists will get into, but I just had a little nugget to share for the beginning of that question, why architecture? Because Ayn Rand actually said something about that in the interview that I was reading before. It actually comes right after she's talking about how she got inspired from the conversation with Marcella. And she says the decision to make it about architecture came immediately after. So I already have it queued up in my notes here. I can read it to you. She says, she's talking about how she made this decision. She says, I think almost immediately, I don't remember the exact details of the steps, but I know that once I had the idea, once I identified the real principle of the second-hander, and I knew that I was discovering something very important here about personal motivation, the next step would be that it would have to be a man, that the hero would be my type of man. It would have to be a man who stands for the creator as such. And I decided on architecture then for two reasons. One, this would fit my desire to write about skyscrapers perfectly, and it fits the theme, because what I wanted to show is who moves the world. What is the creative element in man? The other was the fact that architecture stands halfway between art, science, and business, so that it involves all the aspects of productive career. Not for plot potentialities, because plot-wise, it was one of the hardest. No, for ideological potentialities, just what I named, that for the best expression of the theme. If I want to show what is the nature of a creative man, then I want a profession which would apply to art, to science in the sense of engineering, and to business. And for that purpose, architecture was perfect. Now, I was consciously aware of that this fits my purpose for this way. At the same time, it occurred to me immediately was the result of the fact that I did want to write about American architecture and fit it. So it was like two considerations integrated. So that was her answer.
Wonderful. That's fantastic. Next up is Sherri.
Yep. Thank you, Joia, for having that queued up just like that, because I would have tried to bungle it because I didn't have it queued up. But also there's another thing I think that ties into that. There was a very similar experience happening in the architectural world before Ayn Rand was actually doing her research. So she had seen some of these same issues discussed publicly, hammered out, fought over. They allude to it a little bit when they talk about the Chicago Columbian exhibition. It's known often as the White City, where the historicists came in and essentially changed everything. The conversation that was budding, that was growing, that there was this discussion happening, kind of got cut off at that point for quite not entirely obviously, but at a pretty major level. So she also saw this happening in the world, that these discussions at some level were out there, that this was a kind of story that was actually being grappled with in the real world.
I wanted to add something else I think the thing is, it was like architecture, the history of architecture before Ayn Rand started writing. She started writing this in the early mid-30s. The history of architecture for the 30 or 40 years before that was like a tailor-made backdrop for precisely this issue of the original creator versus the conformist, or the person who's repeating everything else. But I also want to add, I think she chose architecture for precisely the reason that seems paradoxical that motivated the question, which is because it would force this self-sufficient individual to go out and have to interact with other people. So let's suppose we made him a poet or a painter, right? You could be a poet without needing anybody at all. You could go off into the mountains. Roark could have built a little cabin up in that mountain where that lake was, that we saw him at the very beginning. He could have stayed there and written poetry, and subsisted on very little. He's a very self-sufficient guy. He doesn't have a need for lots of luxury. He could have stayed there and written as many poems as he liked without having to ever deal with anybody or ask permission from anybody. it's precisely the fact. Now, this is something, by the way, that I see all the time, in difference in my career and Sherri's career, which is if she wants to have building work, she has to convince somebody to spend a large amount of money. Somebody has to be willing to trust her with they're going to spend this a large amount of money. And she's often dealing with residential clients building their dream home, so it's a significant amount of their life savings that's going into this. So that person, she has to have a relationship with that person. She has to work with a builder. It draws her into a network of connections with other people. Whereas in my job as a writer, I like to, a lot of my work is spent alone in a dark room at 3 o'clock in the morning with nobody. And I don't want anybody else around because they'll just interrupt me and it interrupt my chain of thought. And, I have to get myself published, but it's a lot, especially in this day and age, it's a lot easier to just go out and publish and start a blog, put it up on these days. You can just go on Substack and in 5 minutes you're up and going. So it's a lot easier. I don't need to get somebody to spend a lot of money and make a big commitment. It's a lot easier for me to be the independent guy out there on my own, saying whatever I want. It's harder to make money at it. It's harder to make a living at it, but to actually do the work and to get it published, at least in some form, doesn't require anywhere near as much cooperation with. And if somebody were to say to me, who will let you write this stuff, it would seem ridiculous. It doesn't seem as ridiculous when the dean says it, because you do have to get somebody to spend the money on a building. So I think that's precisely why she did that, is to draw it out into the fact that he's going to have to take this self-sufficient individual and draw him out into a profession where, in order to achieve that vision he has to do it in cooperation with other people. And that's what drives the plot.
And get back to something that Joia has said in previous meetups about Hugo. You need to have a massive conflict for the story arc to really have teeth. And if it's Howard Roark, the poet on the mountainside, there's not that massive 30-year goal that he has to overcome in order to get the end result at the end of the novel.
I will add two things. One is that the theme of this novel is that there is something inside us that transforms the world, and architecture does that. It provides a dramatic, artistic example, demonstration of that, far better than anything else, because it's literally transforming of the world. The second point about the objective and subjective, most in today's thinking, whenever people think about something inside, they always think about just primarily, what do I feel like about anything? Ayn Rand and Louis Sullivan are coming from a very different place. When they talk about form and functionality, they are saying that what is in us is our capacity to recognize functions outside, objective functions outside, understand the core of them, and then they absorb all of it and produce something that meets those functionalities and has the emotional qualities, so that while meeting all the functionalities, they will speak not only to the body, but to the mind, emotion, and spirit of the person using that building. That's the kind of work that is there. And creation of that integration is an individual process, but it's an individual process that starts with and ends with an objective thing. And only by starting and ending with the objective thing, the value, the individual is creating the value. All right, the next question I'm going to take is the question on why is Ayn Rand so popular in India? So who'd like to answer that? Go ahead and type exclamation mark if you'd like to answer that. Maritza.
Did you say why is it popular in India, or just why is it popular?
Or why is it popular? So we can say why is it popular and why is it popular in India? It's two questions if you want.
If I were to have to guess, I would say that it's because there really do exist so few works of art that are shining the spotlight on the unapologetic ideal. You know, Howard Roark stands straight and he stands tall, and there's just not that many works out there that do that, and that's enticing.
Wonderful. Jyoti.
I will give two answers, one for why it's popular and why it's popular in India. It's popular because it's a true depiction of the society. What exists in society, different people have different ethics, different morals, and how they see their responsibility in life according to those morals and those ethics, and also place themselves in those characters' lives and see if that is what they want. Because it's from the, starting to end, the whole journey they see in this fountainhead. There's a meanness, there's kindness, there is romance, there is love, and there is resolution. So I think that is why people are able to see themselves in different roles, and that's why it is popular. Now, the question was why it is popular in India, especially for the high schoolers. All the high schoolers you will see that they're walking around with this book in India, at least when I was growing up. I think this, firstly, Ayn Rand had a lot of influence in India. Her literature had a lot of influence in India. And secondly, I think it's during that age group, student is developing a lot of morals and ethics and to navigate the life, because that's really, it's not after college that they start navigating the life. It is at that time they are beginning to think about how their life should go. So having read this book, students get their, they change their mind, of course, but it gives them a fairly good idea about in what direction they should go. So that's my take. I don't know whether I'm right or wrong, but that's my take. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jyoti. Next up is Rupali.
So I think, the contrasts that you see in either Atlas Shrugged or Fountainhead, those contrasts were real for me in India growing up. And perhaps they're not as obvious in America, but coming from India, I would say that, in Romantic Manifesto, Ayn Rand talks about the damage society can do on a child because of constantly beating out the sense of life from the child to just agree with everybody else, or to conform to traditions and to conform to what is an acceptable way of life, and not let the child develop their own motives and own values. I think that traditionally it is prevalent in India, not consciously saying we're going to beat this out of every child, but because of traditions, there's very little scope to say, okay, try it your own way. And I feel that Ayn Rand says this very well. She says, it is this, yet this is the view with which in various degrees of longing, wistfulness, passion, and agonized confusion, the best of mankind's youth start in life. It is not even a view for most of them, but a foggy, groping, undefined sense made of raw pain and incommunicable happiness. And I think it's that, children have that value, that sense of life. And there's the hope that, think of any high school or middle, just, a child going into college. They know that they think that they can change the world, right? And they have that optimism in them. And this book allows children to say that it is possible, that this is possible, and you can live a life like this. Ayn Rand also says, she talks about there are very few guideposts to find, and the Fountainhead is one of them for people who are seeking something like this. So I feel it's the contrasts that you see in India and that she has been able to put it really in a very stark contrast in Fountainhead, that this book is very popular.
Thank you. Thank you, Rupali. Next up is Joe.
I think Rupali actually just captured what I was going to say much more eloquently, in the sense that just the opposite that exists, this individualism, as opposed to, and if you think about the time that this was written and why, in her background in general, where there was extreme collectivism, she comes from the Bolshevik Revolution, you know, you have that background. This is in stark contrast to that. And there's always going to have, you're always going to have somebody that's going to want to deviate from what the collective wisdom, or I'm not going to call it wisdom, but what the collective believes. So, I mean, I think that this is just something that it's almost like a superhero character that is actually going to, you know, that's going to answer the people's problems. There's always going to be problems in any system. So then, therefore, you create an ideal of some sort that people are going to gravitate to. That's I think that's pretty simple answer.
Thanks, Joe. Next up is Rob and Sherri. Rob, you need to unmute.
I did it the other way around.
Yeah. All right. So I wanted to say something about this, guys. I mentioned earlier, you know, as a writer, you always have to be plugging your work. So I'm just sending out in the chat a link to an article I had published about a week and a half ago in Quillette that kind of addresses this. And it's the idea of specifically Ayn Rand championing the idea of work and achievement as a source of value and meaning in your life, as opposed to what people are generally offered as the alternatives. And I think in that article, specifically talking about, there's a couple sociologists who talk about how what we live in today is a culture of victimhood, where it's being a victim or being part of a marginalized group, is being oppressed, and being, you know, on the receiving end of microaggressions. That's what gives you meaning and status in your life. Or there's been a lot of complaints recently that politics has taken the place of religion, that it's the thing that gives people, you know, the fact that they have certain political views gives them that gives meaning and direction and purpose and status to their life. Whereas Ayn Rand, her fundamental message is that it's your work, and, you know, Howard Roark is the ultimate example, my work done my way. It's your work and your achievements that give meaning and value to your life. And so I'm really thinking of the passage here where Roark is talking to the dean. He says, "But you see," said Roark quietly, "I have, let's say, 60 years to live. Most of that time will be spent working. I've chosen the work I want to do. If I find no joy in it, then I'm only condemning myself to 60 years of torture. And I can find the joy only if I do my work in the best possible way to me. But the best is a matter of standards, and I set my own standards. I inherit nothing. I stand at the end of no tradition. I may perhaps stand at the beginning of one." So, and then the next line is, the dean asks, "How old are you?" And he says, 22. He says, "Oh, quite excusable." And the dean seemed relieved. So he gets to dismiss that. But really, you know, when you think about it, young people are about to start on this world. They have 60 years ahead of them. They're going to start into a world of work where they have to decide, what course am I going to take in life? What am I going to pursue? What am I going to do for the next 60 years of my life? So being offered, this is, you know, this speech that he gives to the dean is really speaking to the young person reading this, saying, you know, you are at this point where you have to choose what you're going to do with the next 60 years of your life. And here's how you can find something that will actually be meaningful and provide you enjoyment and fulfillment. And I think that's a key to the enduring popularity of the book.
Excellent. Next up is Houheneka.
Yeah, one of the things I was thinking about when Rob was talking was when we were doing the Gita meetup last night, and we were talking about doing the work and the attachment, and, you know, how it talks about in the Gita about, you know, you do the work, right, but you don't get attached to the result. And that's what I was thinking with work and being this ideal character, because he's going to do the work. Like the quote, I love that quote. I think I wrote it down. And it's about the joy is in doing your best work. It isn't necessarily how it's going to be received by other people, because then that's something outside of you. You can't help how it's received. And there was another quote that I love that I think adds to the popularity is in chapter 1, it says, Roark says every form has its own meaning. Every man creates his meaning and form and goal. And this struck me because it's the ability to create your own life. And I think that's the stark contrast between Keating and Roark, is that Roark is creating his own life. He's giving it his own life meaning, whereas Keating is looking for meaning outside of himself and like beating other people and being competitive. So I think that's part of it too. It's just this, Keating's very competitive, but he's not happy.
Wonderful, thank you. I just want to answer it from the Indian perspective. And this is something that most Americans don't grasp. The old world cultures like India are very traditional cultures, up to a point where people do not even ask the question, what do I want to do? They ask the question, what am I supposed to do? And their family, their society, their caste, their group of people around them tell them what to do. And that's what their life is on all their choices. And that is the dominant way. Here in America, we have individualism is far more rampant and more expressed. Now, a large variety of it these days is more subjectivist, of saying, okay, I just feel this, which is different. So, and if you look at Ayn Rand, she grew up in Russia. So that is the old world. That is very much of that kind of traditional society. That's just a background I wanted to point out. The next question is, let's take the question on the character of Peter Keating. And so feel free to give spoilers, folks. So Peter Keating, let's first focus, let's keep Roark aside, okay? Because we're going to run into that theme many, many times. But about Katie, what is the nature of the relationship between Katie and Peter? So we'll start with Sherri and Rob, and then Joia. Sherri.
I think you were reading my mind, Shrikant, because I wanted to tie back to Evanik's question based on what we've all been talking about here, about Roark being the one who is finding his work his way. Katie is the deepest example of what Keating is doing in the opposite way. The one value that he deeply holds is this love for this woman. And repeatedly, over and over again, he denies that one value because of other people. In most cases, this is the situation with his mother, and his mother constantly dribbling voices into his head about how Katie wasn't going to be the bride that's going to help you get ahead in your career. So, and this mother's been doing this since he was a young boy. We also hear in the early chapters, one of his other loves of painting. That's another firsthand love, goal, value of his that he denies himself because he's listening and he's allowing someone else to make that value choice. And so his mother, again, in that situation, tells him that architecture is a much more, I'm not sure which word she uses, respectable profession than being a painter. And so we'll see these examples come up as ways that Ayn Rand's using to show you how much Keating is denying the deepest values he has and is instead very deliberately choosing someone else's value instead of his own. It's terribly sad.
Yeah. Well, the way I would put it is that Keating is a guy who spends the whole novel killing his self. Right? Whatever there is of himself, he kills it in order to conform to what others expect him to be. And he's done that basically his whole life up to the beginning of the story. So there's not a lot of himself left. And so she had to give the character one thing that he had left. So, and Katie is the one thing he has left that is a value, but purely his own personal, private thing. Notice they never meet with other friends. He doesn't share this with the world. So it's the one thing he has left for himself. And of course, then he's going to have to be forced to kill it and to destroy that relationship and to betray her. And of course, literally,
and betray himself.
Well, betray himself by betraying her.
Mhm.
And of course, she fits in this category that writers have, and Ayn Rand does this a number of times, of creating a minor character for the sole purpose of killing them all. Now she doesn't kill Katie. Well, she kind of spiritually kills Katie later on. But
spoiler,
it's the only. I was thinking about this when I was reading this just now, that the only function Katie serves in this is to be a personal value that Keating betrays and destroys.
Mhm.
So but someone mentioned the characters as extremes. So I'm going to combine this with my answer to another question. Yes, her characters are these extremes, and I think somebody mentioned they're like superheroes, right? We don't ask, is Superman an extreme character? Well, yes, Superman is an extreme character, but you know that he's there to represent certain qualities literarily. So she draws her characters out to full extremes. Now, I want to mention, though, that Peter Keating is a real person. I know him. I actually had a childhood friend who basically was Peter Keating. And we actually used to, long before the Fountainhead in high school, my friends, people who knew him used to joke that if you got him in the room and 6 people took one position and 6 people took the other position, he wouldn't know what to do. He might explode because he wouldn't know what group to fit in with. Mm-hmm. He was somebody I grew up with on the same street I lived on when I was a kid, and he's such an extreme version. So Peter Keating is a real person. He's a real thing out there. I've met people like that. I've seen Ellsworth Tuohy's and that type. But she is drawing out to extremes. But Katie is there because she can't draw him to the extreme where he has no personal values at all. He sacrificed them all already. She has to have a couple little things left in him that are his real self, so that she can further develop the character by having him betray those things.
Thank you, Rob. Next up, Rob and Sherri. Next up is Joia, followed by Maritza. Joia.
I'm really glad that Rob and Sherri pretty much said everything I wanted to say about Katie, but that I wanted to follow up because Houheneka had asked about Roark too. And we see the same pattern with Roark. And I think it's really significant. And I even just wanted to read the section because it's one of my favorite little sections that I think is just beautifully written. So I wanted to even just pause on this. But this is when Peter comes back and sees Roark sitting on the steps. And he says, or the text says, there was no part that he could ever play in Roark's presence. Besides, he did not feel like playing a part now. He heard a leaf rustling in its fall to the earth. It was a thin, glassy spring sound. He knew for the moment that he felt affection for Roark, an affection that held pain, astonishment, and helplessness. And I think we're seeing with what his responses to Roark is similar to Katie, that with everybody else, Keating is always playing the part, but not with Katie and not with Roark. And I even just love that little description of the leaf that's rustling and the thin, glassy spring sound. So, it's the graduation, it's the season of spring, but I think she's, we're also in the spring of their lives, and we're seeing just how fragile Peter Keating is in this way, that Peter Keating does have this authentic self. We know that he loves painting, but he's given that up for architecture. We know that he loves Katie in an authentic way, but that's, very fragile. And here's also this sort of really fragile moment with Roark. And we see that he's at this point where maybe it could go either way. He hasn't, lived out the life and made the decision, but he's going to. And then even what follows this after, where what Keating says when he starts speaking to Howard, he says, well, I don't know why I should come to you, but Howard, I've never said it before, but you see, I'd rather have your opinion on things than the dean's. I'd probably follow the dean's, but it's just that yours means more to me myself. I don't know why I'm saying this either. And another one of the beauties, I think, of Ayn Rand's prose is really kind of showing this this introspective sense of Keating, that we see he's having this really strong, like Sullivan would call it, sort of the intuition, that kind of subconscious emotional reaction to things, and he's struggling to put it into words, but he's even kind of coming into these realizations as he's trying to put it into words. The way he's having this response to Roark. And part of what I've even found beautiful about this literarily, I talked before about how Ayn Rand was inspired by this person, Marcella, but I always think there's an important distinction to make between Marcella and Peter Keating, in that Peter Keating really does have a real love-hate relationship with Howard Roark, which we see here, that there's a way in which Keating does see the value in Roark, see something special, and even in his response to him, like that brings out his authenticity, which I think is something that is beautiful for how the novel progresses. Kind of what Rupali was saying earlier about the way that we see these characters in their pure form, that probably even the person that Rob knew who was a Peter Keating was probably even closer to a Marcella, and maybe not even at any level. Like we don't even see from Marcella, and sadly I think it's true that some people don't even have any level of that authenticity. They don't have a Katie or a painting, or wouldn't have this genuine response to Roark, where Peter Keating is that much more of a complex character, and it's just more interesting in terms of the novel to have him have more of this love-hate relationship with Roark, as opposed to just a pure diametric opposition. That's what I wanted to share.
Thank you, Joia. Next up is Maritza.
So, if I took and I was looking at these characters as, aspects of ourselves. So if we're looking at it from that perspective, I would almost say that both Peter and Katie, and especially their interaction with each other, it shines a spotlight on two people living with no selves. Neither of them have a self. They are at the whims of other people in extremely different ways, but yet it's very stark there. And so Peter finds a calmness with Katie because he can drop the pretense that he lives with day to day, but it's only because she's even emptier than he is. Now he's full of a bunch of negative emotion. She has none. She just stands and lets whoever stands closest to her fill her with whatever it is they need her to have in that moment. I think that both of these characters are Ayn Rand showing us what we may become should we just drift along. And their interactions throughout the book, we'll see Katie's going to get even more and more pathetic in her just standing there. And Keating is going to get more like pulled apart by his love-hate relationships with those things that he almost wants to admire. Like he wants to love Katie, but then he's like, oh, but she's not pretty enough. Oh, she's too awkward. She doesn't have the right type of clothing. So he doesn't allow himself to truly feel what he could feel. And that's the way he feels about everything. Like even when he finally got the position that he wanted, then he realized I have to actually do work. And so there was no joy there. And so these are empty people. These are people without a self. And I think that that's what they show us throughout the book. And that's a relationship I see there. This is unhealthy and not to be, how do you say, followed. These should not be the characters we want to be like. Thank you.
Wow, that was very observant. That was wonderful. Sherri.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Maritza. That was fantastic. And I wanted to tie in to reference to, again, a Sullivan discussion we had before. Katie is the soup can.
Up on the shelf.
She's the soup can. Just waiting to be filled.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, that's so true.
Yeah. To stab her becoming individuals. She really made an honest stab at it. She really tried, but she did not end well for her.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Next up is going to be Houheneka.
Yeah, I thank you, because I was just wondering about this relationship. I think I had a little bit of a respect for Katie. I'm not sure if that's appropriate. I haven't read the whole book. I just read the first 5 chapters. And I think I respected her because she knew who Peter Keating was and she accepted it. But yet to me, it was almost like she was indifferent towards him, which I kind of admired a bit, because sometimes people lose themselves or get mad over things that they can't control. Like most people would have gotten upset and mad. And even Peter is like, well, why aren't you upset when I don't come when I say I do? And basically the response is like, oh, I just know who you are. And I think that's striking. Like I think I get Maritza's point about the pathetic part of Katie, because she keeps accepting it back. But I see it almost, and I get that, and I don't disagree with it, but I also see it as you accept a person for who they are, and even you're choosing to be with them or you're choosing not to be with them. So I think, to me, from what I saw, and I might change my mind as it goes on, but Katie I see as making a choice to be with Peter as he stands right now. So she knows when he says, I'm going to come back tomorrow, that could be 1 month, that could be 3 months, right? It says it right there in the book. She knows that and she accepts that. And I think that's, to me, what makes Katie a powerful character, is that she's making a conscious decision to choose it. Now, whether you agree or disagree, that's one thing. But I think her and Roark are parallel, just like Roark really quickly knows what Peter's going to do. He's going to, like when Peter goes to him for help, he knows that Peter's going to take his work and present it as his own. He's clear about that, but he's being true to who he is. And again, he's making that choice. So that's just what I saw. And I don't disagree with Maritza, but it's just.
Thank you. Thank you, Houheneka. All right, folks. So this is off to a great start. Next time we are going to cover 6 to 10, because on 11th, Howard Roark is going to open his own office. So that really begins a new part. So then the one after that would be from 11th to the end of part 1. That would be the third session. So next time it is 6 to 10. I think the format is going very, very well. I think everything is good. So so people, if you want to give any feedback on the format, if you have any kind of general logistical questions, go ahead and ask now. What do you guys think? So firstly, the panelists, how do you think the format is working? Good. Okay, excellent. All right, let me see here. Thanks all. Yeah, we will come to, there are some questions that we didn't get to. I'm trying to also keep the time. That's what I have to do. And I've chosen the questions this time which would bring out the material, the beginning, whatever it is that we wanted to discuss. I thought these questions were fantastic. The architecture, why, what is the impact on Fountainhead, and then the character of Katie. That was a good way to do the questions. All right, folks. So I'm really excited about this series. See you next time. Again, same time, 2 p.m. Eastern time on Saturday. Bye, everybody.
Great.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.